Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Kathryn Bruni-Young. So Kathryn has a large background she's a movement educator, background in yoga, strength training, play, all kinds of fun things. She was recommended to me by a whole load of people. Joining us from snowy Canada today, Kathryn, welcome.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And what was the beginning of your journey? How did you get interested in working with the body?
So I was always a really active little kid. I come from a family of Italian people who are super outdoorsy, active. My grandparents, who I basically grew up with, along with my real parents, were just these super strong, kind of do-it-yourself, figure it out people. And so I ended up hanging out a lot with them as a young person and just always being outside with them. My grandfather was always working on something, growing something, fixing something. And so I think I've always come to movement pretty naturally as a young person. And then I went to art school in elementary school. I went to art school also in high school. And so that meant that I could do like dance as one of my classes. So it wasn't all just sitting down at a desk, which I figured pretty early on was not going to work for me very well. I started taking dance classes when my mom had her first yoga studio. There was a little dance class happening down the hall.
Just to step in, this is something we have in common, right? Like my mom taught a bit of yoga, your mom's taught a lot of yoga. You actually pretty much grew up in a yoga studio.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I grew up before I could go to my mom's classes. I would go to the dance classes down the hall. I did that for quite a while. And then eventually I just started hanging out in my mom's yoga studio. I was always around that practice, but at the same time, I was always doing dance. And then I did a little bit of gymnastics. I did some sports. It wasn't until I was kind of like a pre-teen, early teenager when I got started out doing yoga. And it's interesting because initially I started doing yoga and I wasn't really that into it. Like it didn't feel that interesting. When my mom was first teaching those first number of years, it was like an Ashtanga practice. It was very hot, very sweaty, very physical practice. And I remember going to those classes and just thinking like, these people are nuts. Like, this is not cool.
Yeah, I still think that.
And then at that point, I was also really into gymnastics. So I was into like running around the room and, flipping over things and having this really, really vigorous movement practice. And when I go to yoga, it would just feel like, this is so boring. Like, it's not hard enough. It's too hot. I'm too sweaty. But then when I decided that gymnastics was not going to be right for me for the long term, I did maybe a year of competitions. And then I very quickly realized, okay, like this thing is not for me. I'm not really into competitive sports. The anxiety of it was just killing me. It made it so that it was not fun at all anymore. And that's when I really started getting back into yoga because it felt like a little bit more reasonable for my body. So as I was going through high school, 16, 17, 18, yoga felt better for my body, not quite as crazy as gymnastics was. And I liked the more like not sporty side of it. It wasn't like a competitive sport. I never had to go. Like if I wanted to go, I could, but I didn't have to show up for like team practice or anything like that. And I practiced yoga pretty full on. That was the only thing I did, Ashtanga yoga. With my mom, I practiced quite a bit with Richard Freeman. I practiced with every teacher who came through Downward Dog, which was the name of my mom's studio, every traveling workshop I took. And I did that for probably a solid 5 years. At the end of that 5 years, I was noticing I was starting to have some problems with my body. Like things just weren't moving as well as I thought they should be moving and working. I was only 22 years old at that point, and I felt like I should be a little bit more resilient.
A little
like,
bit young to be knackered out, isn't it? 22.
Yeah, exactly. And it was such a coincidence because I remember doing my last big yoga training with Richard Freeman, which I loved. And I still love working with him. I love what he puts out. And I came home And then I had a friend over from California, and he was like, have you ever heard this guy named Ido Portal? And I was like, no, who is he? He's like, get your laptop. We're doing this right now. Like, we're going to watch some handstand videos. And I was super into handstands at that point because of my gymnastics background. And so I just saw this guy's videos and I was like, whoa, this is amazing. And my friend Ian had actually worked with him and met him before. And he was like, if Ido ever comes to Canada, like, you should go. Just don't even think about it. Just go. And I swear, like 2 or 3 weeks later, he was coming to Toronto, and that's where I lived at that point. And he was teaching this workshop at this CrossFit gym down the street from my house, a place where my mom and I had always walked by to go to the yoga studio. And we'd like look in the windows and everyone's like throwing stuff and ropes and tires and like really aggressive looking exercise. And I remember walking by that place with my mom every day and just thinking like, those people are nuts. Like, who would do that? And that's where the workshop was. And so I ended up going to this place, this gym, to take Ido's workshop. And that was the turning point. That was when everything started to make so much sense. Then I started getting interested in strength training. Then I realized that there was just a whole world out there that I had never really been exposed to. Mm-hmm. And that was really the beginning of what I'm doing now.
Okay, great. So I definitely want to come to the kind of mindful strength stuff as a kind of key theme for today. I think that's really interesting. But I want to take apart a few bits of this story because I think it's interesting. First of all, how old are you now? You look, people can't see because it's a podcast, but you look shockingly young to me. I think you may be the youngest person we've had on the show. And I'm not ageist because I used to get a lot of ageism when I was teaching in my 20s. So don't hear that as a judgment. I'm simply curious. Like where are you at now?
Yeah, so I'm 28. I'm turning 29 in a few months.
I'm just asking because I'm interested in, as far as I'm concerned, especially if someone's been training since they were a kid like you have, they can know a lot of stuff by the time they're 28. And so I don't hold that against you. I think it's just worth noting. I think you're the youngest person we've had on the show, maybe by 10 years.
Okay.
So I'm just trying to think through the other guests. Like most of them were at least in their mid-30s. So yeah, it's nice for me to have a guest on who I'm not usually. I'm the youngest one in the room with embodiment teachers. So that's cool. And we both had this kind of weird thing of being second generation in a way. Like your mom is well known for a group I've been involved in on Facebook, and one of the earlier yoga teachers, as far as I can tell, in Canada. Mm-hmm. And one of the studio owners. And my mom was doing like traditional, embarrassing Iyengar yoga when I was a kid, and she had like old school kind of green goddess, I think it was, and in the leotard, before the cool leggings. So we've both kind of grown up with it a little bit. They had a Philip Smith on, who was an Aikido teacher, whose dad's also a really famous Aikido teacher, and he grew up with it. So, how is it to kind of grow up in that environment?
Yoga always seemed super normal to me because I would watch my mom do yoga. I mean, I literally grew up with my mom watching Richard Freeman's Primary Series VHS video in my living room. And so I grew up thinking that, this whole thing is totally normal and we're all vegetarians and it's totally normal and all my friends do yoga and everyone we know is like in the bubble, which was great because I was exposed to all of these things. I really learned what it was like to have a practice. Like I watched my mom every day do her practice. And I think that that's something I take forward so much into the rest of my life and with strength training. And on the other hand, because yoga was my whole life and my family life and everything, it was hard when we all started to realize, when my mom started to realize that like what we've been doing is maybe not working so well. It was like, but I've grown up with this thing and this thing has been totally normal.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things there, isn't there? Like one is like, are you exposed to the sort of full range of kind of people? I say that from the bubble of Brighton, which is kind of Boulder, Colorado, or Austin, or somewhere where I am now. Most of my friends are life coaches, yoga teachers, and holistic therapists. And it's like, in terms of just not being around like any normal people. And, the other one, as you say, is that feeling of like growing up with something, and maybe it's traditional martial arts or traditional yoga. And the same way the martial artists had this like disillusionment when the Gracies came along and just started choking everybody out in mixed martial arts. They were like, shit, I've been told side kicks are really effective, and now we're finding out they're not, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
There's like a real disillusionment. A friend of mine from Lithuania is just going through that with Aikido. You know, he went and put his Aikido up against some MMA people and just got murdered. And now he's really kind of going through a kind of, you know, does he commit to truth, or does he kind of retreat back to the dogma of his youth? And I've seen the yoga community do that. And, you know, the Facebook group that your mum set up, which is, you know, had so many people a part of, I've just seen over the last few years, like, the whole yoga community go, wow, there's more to movement than downwards dog and chaturanga.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty amazing. When I met Ito 6 years ago, and at that point, all my friends were yoga teachers, and no one else was into it. Like, I was the crazy one going to the CrossFit gym. Everyone was like, you're going to injure yourself. CrossFit's so dangerous, da, 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 da. Meanwhile, all of my injuries were from doing just too much yoga. And nobody wanted to look at that. And then gradually, bit by bit, things start to change to the point where now 6 years later, like, people invite me to come teach at their yoga studios all over the world. And all I teach them is strength. Like, I don't even teach yoga poses anymore. I've taken it completely out of the thing. And it seems like this is the new wave of like what's helpful for people and what people who are on the cutting edge are interested in. And, you know, on the one hand, it changes very slowly. Like 6 years is a long time to be waiting for everyone else to be like, hey, this is cool. But at the same time, like, we've come a long way. I mean, yoga came to Canada around 25 years ago. My mom was the first teacher. And at that point, you couldn't even buy a yoga mat, like at Winners or whatever, you know.
I saw in your email, your mom was like cutting up yoga mats because you couldn't buy them, like cutting them up from a piece of rubber because it just wasn't, let alone the sort of designer yoga mats. You know, I remember being at a festival and I was doing an exercise about swapping yoga mats to practice non-attachment, and people freaked because they were like, no, you don't understand. My yoga mat's worth $200. There's no way I'm swapping that for some piece of shit, you know? And I was like, wow, that's not attachment. But to go from sort of cutting up pieces of rubber to actually, you know, $200 designer yoga mats with a branded kind of label on is pretty like a big journey. And the other thing I find fascinating about your journey is that maybe people might imagine going from mainstream culture to yoga or martial arts, or, you know, and that journey does happen. People go to the gym, then it gets boring, and they go, you know what, I'm tired of just lifting weights. I want something a bit more spiritual. I want something a bit more mindful, a bit more deep. So they go from maybe the gym to yoga, or the gym to dance, for example, you know, fire rhythms or whatever. But now you've got this movement back the other way as well, right? Which is fascinating. And the main reason I wanted you on as well was because you're doing strength, but with that yoga understanding, like not strength as opposed to mindfulness.
Exactly. Yeah. When I first started doing strength training, I think I was really lucky because the first person I met was Ito, and like, you know, love him or hate him, he taught me a lot of really good things. From there, I started working with a personal trainer who I had met at my CrossFit gym. And I feel really lucky because this man was just fabulous. You know, like, he was the real deal. He understood the body. I feel like he really understood me. And so he could kind of like catch it when I was being weird about stuff. And I was like, oh, but what should I eat to have this like perfect exercise? And he was like, dude, just eat whatever you want. Like, it's going to be fine. He was really, really helpful. He mentored me for 2 years. Through working with him, I realized how mindful people could be, even in a fitness, strength and conditioning, sport, whatever you want to call it, environment. It's like I always had this idea that like, oh, if you wanted to do a spiritual practice or a spiritual type of movement, it was either yoga or maybe like Tai Chi or something like that, something that was less aggressive. And then I started doing strength training and I was like, no, it doesn't really have anything to do so much with the movements. It's like, how are we doing these movements? And what's the driving force? And then what I've come to now is like, I actually feel like the movements in strength training but produce a more mindful effect because they can bring people into their bodies so much, and actually like feeling like you have strength. I find, at least with the people I work with, gives them this sense of confidence, this sense of like, I can feel my body and I can feel its power and I can move through the world and do the movements I need to do and do the things I need to do from this place of like really being in my body in a strong way, as opposed to being in my body and wanting it to contort into these crazy shapes or have this feeling of lightness or trying to literally rip it apart.
Okay, let's pick that apart. Some great stuff in there. I mean, I likewise had this kind of snobbery that, weight training and strength training, I know they're two different things, was really for kind of like meatheads at the gym, and I was kind of like above that, I had this like spiritual snobbery. And then, I actually rediscovered weight training, and a friend of mine, Rob McNamara, wrote a book called To Awaken, which I highly recommend. And it's like the Zen of weightlifting. It's all about, letting go and practicing, complete vulnerability in the infinite. I mean, it's like the deepest book you've ever read. Like this guy, is literally a Zen monk, and it's ridiculous, And I was like, wow, this is about weightlifting, and it really, really inspired me. And I lifted weights for a few years, and realized I'd just been being a snob, basically. And the one thing I would stand by is sometimes the environment and the group you're with really make a difference, right? Like there's nothing in the practice itself which make it less mindful, less spiritual. And I want to hear about you saying even more mindful, perhaps. But sometimes, like if I went to LA Fitness and there's like TVs and everyone's watching the TV, like that environment more than the weights was the problem. Like the culture was the problem, not the weights or the yoga or whatever.
Yeah, I think the culture is everything. And I mean, I go to gyms all over the place. Whenever I travel, I usually go to the gym. And I mean, I still run into behaviors that are just like, it just seems so ridiculous to me.
Yeah.
Like people in the gym, they don't really warm up. They do these crazy heavy lifts. They're like grunting and groaning all over the place. It's like, it's just so theatrical. And it's like, I have to push my body to the max every second. And, that's not really what I'm talking about so much. But I think that if you have the right skills, and this is a lot of the work that I do when I teach workshops, it's like I oftentimes lately have been taking the workshop into the gym, and it could be any big box gym with like whatever cardio equipment in it and stuff. If we go into these places with a new mindset around it can be really helpful, but it's hard because oftentimes a gym or a fitness environment is not as sensitive as maybe a yoga environment might be. And I think that's a big reason as to why a lot of people don't want to go to the gym, because they think there's going to be loud music and people are watching them, and people, might
feeling
not be
judged is one reason, isn't it? And it's just the amount of sensory overload, like TV's blaring, kind of MTV. And I know yoga teachers who teach yoga classes in gyms and really struggle just because they, the environment they have to walk through, and that, just to get to the class, even if the music isn't coming through the walls, which it usually is, but even if it isn't, there's still a way they have to kind of go through that to teach their yoga class, let alone anything else. So I feel like there's some really valid stuff there in terms of the culture. The other thing you talk to, which I'd really like to pick up on, is the idea that you feeling strong in yourself can be really helpful. And I've given strength training to many clients as a practice who lacked confidence. And it's like their whole system beforehand was like a little collapsed. And it wasn't just that they were physically wimpy, it was that they were emotionally wimpy. I'm using judgmental words here, but just to give you the idea, there was a way in which they didn't have, they kind of looked like a flaccid penis. And then by the end of it, they had that kind of like confidence of like expansiveness. And like, I actually know nothing better than sort of mindful strength training for that embodied quality.
Yeah. I mean, so my main demographic, when I travel and I teach, it's all like younger, I don't know, 30 to 50s yoga teachers who show up. But I live in a small town and I teach classes twice a week out of my home studio. And the main demographic of people I work with at home are like women over the age of 50. I'd say 50 to 70. And, all my private clients here come to me because they need more strength, but they don't care about doing any fancy movements. Like these people are not interested in doing a pull-up or whatever, or anything like that. They literally just need to feel more confident in their bodies. And a lot of them have bone mass issues. And this is, a huge thing that I've seen, especially working with this demographic, is like everyone I meet over the age of 60 has some type of bone mass issue. And they're all very nervous about picking something up or tying their shoe or bending over the wrong way. I think that, even with younger people, when we don't feel like we have the strength we need to do not only what we need to do, but also what we want to do, I think this has a real effect on people's psyche. And their emotions and their feelings. Like, so much of what we think is coming up from the body. And we've kind of got it the wrong way. We think that the thoughts are in our mind, and then maybe they stay there, or maybe they go into our body. But it's like, it's going the opposite way.
The normal way of thinking is get some confidence so you can do something. But from a strength training point of view, you say, learn to do something so you can get some confidence. Like, actually, have your body capable of doing something. And you'll see this, a lot of people don't realize that strength training is actually one of the best things for older people, just physiologically, but in terms of muscle mass and bone density, it's like the single best recommended exercise for aging is strength training. Now, you don't necessarily have to be lifting huge weights, but, it can be a stretch band or little sandbags or whatever. But people don't realize that. And the second thing is, as you say, like, to get that, once people get into that place where they're not confident, then they actually start falling over more. They actually start using their body less, and then their health deteriorates. And I've seen this also used very beautifully with sort of teenage girls, and, they're coming into their bodies, and society's throwing all this shit this way, and they collapse in their bodies, and they lose their sort of emotional strength, then they lose their scholastic strength and start doing less well in school, whereas girls do better at first. And it's like, actually, that can be great for those groups who otherwise are at kind of vulnerable points for their confidence, right? Whether it's the teenage years, or whether it's being elderly, or, maybe something bad's happened in their life, they've had some trauma. Like, it just seems to me like one of the best confidence building tools.
Yeah. And I think it also helps people to like feel their body, and like literally like feel the edges of their body. And I've done a bit of work with a woman also in Canada named Jane Clapp, and she does movement for trauma. She's a strength coach, and she focuses purely on trauma. And, she talks about how like doing core strength exercises literally helps us feel our core. And if you know about your core, like the trunk and the core is there to protect you. It's like protecting the stuff on the inside that's most important and also most vulnerable, like physically. And then if we can strengthen the boundaries of the core, we're literally strengthening and containing the parts of our physical bodies which are most vulnerable and important for function. And when we have that sensation in our bodies, of course, we're going to feel more strong and competent and strong in ourselves, like strong enough to stand up for ourselves and to really ask ourselves what we want and what we need. And so, I think that strength training goes so much further than doing fancy exercises. I'm on both sides, because I love doing these like super athletic big feats. And at the same time, all of the research I look at on strength training, like if you go into whatever PubMed or any type of like research funnel, all the research there is done on, seniors. A lot of the research, there's some on kids, there's some on sports, but it's overwhelming how much research there is about like older adults living in community dwellings, doing strength training, 12-week program. And after 12 weeks, they have less anxiety. They have better confidence, blood pressure, all the things, muscle mass.
If you take any disempowered population, whether it's being elderly or teenage or poor or traumatized, there's a feeling of disempowerment, of having one's boundaries violated. Then, what's maybe the most simple way to address that is quite literally empowerment, is getting more physically powerful. And I've particularly seen the use of some of the pushing away movements, for example, like a bench press or a press up, if we use body weight. Like, I find those extensor muscle movements of sort of pushing away can be super helpful for people having a sense of their own boundaries. and the sense of their own ability to kind of keep stuff away from them, their own ability to decide to let something in or not. And that feeling of extending power out as opposed to being in that kind of collapsed kind of flop response that can be the result of, disempowering life situations or trauma.
Yeah. I mean, being able to I love the feeling. I've really boiled this down because I've thought a lot about like, why do I go to the gym so much? Like, what am I always getting out of this? And I've really boiled this down to like, I love the feeling of being under resistance, like having something to resist against, and then feeling like I can actually overcome that resistance and overcome that load. And like, you just feel good in your body, like emotionally, but then also the feelings that creates, like the blood flow and the neurological connection with the muscles, like these things, if they're done in a way that's manageable, from my experience, feel really good. But then when it gets to the point where it's unmanageable, like I have also been in fitness environments. I took a weightlifting seminar 2 years ago with my boyfriend because he's a competitive weightlifting coach. And so we went to go take this workshop with this like super famous American weightlifting teacher. And I walked in super confident in my own strength. I know how to do the moves. Like I am the best case scenario going into that class. And I didn't realize that they were going to want us to max out. And I wasn't prepared to max out, like whatever. And so I went in and I was like, I'm just going to lift this much and this is going to be my max for today. And I feel good about this.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like, I don't care about beating these people's numbers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Some huge Canadian dude next to you. It's probably not going to happen anyway, right?
Yeah. And so I was doing the list and doing everything they wanted us to do and like super enjoying it. And then they were like, okay, you're going to go heavier because it looks like you can go heavier. And I remember like standing my ground on the weightlifting platform and being like, no, you know what? I'm good. Like, I'll keep doing this weight, but I really don't feel like I should go heavier. Like, haven't been doing these movements for a few months. I'm a bit rusty. Of course, they're looking at my body, my like super strong, young, fit, whatever body. And they're like, oh, this girl can do more. And so I say, no, I don't want to do more, but I'll keep doing this. And so I did it for a couple more reps. Then I'm, taking my break on the bench. Then I go back to the bar. And this woman who was coaching yelled at me from across the room. And she was like, more weight on your bar. And I just like looked at her. I was like, no, I'm good. And I like bent over to do my lift. And she ran over to me and she took a weight and she slammed it on my bar. And she was like, you are going to do this lift today. And I burst into tears.
Well, of course, because your boundaries weren't being respected, right? I mean, that's just abuse. Like, and yoga teachers are fucking terrible at this too. Gyms have no idea. There's that culture of like more is better. I was in a hot yoga class a few years back and I remember the teacher just like shouting it, saying, come on, push it, hold it, 10 more seconds. Sometimes it's more seconds, not more weight, right?
Yeah.
And like you'd given her a clear no and she hadn't respected your boundaries. So of course you feel violated. It's upsetting. Like that's the most natural response in the world, if you ask me. And I just think it's sad that in movement in general, but I think gyms, and I don't think yoga is any better. If anything, it's worse, I think, actually, because of the gurus thing, like no one in a gym thinks they're spiritually entitled to tell you, even if they're just a fucking mansplaining asshole. But you know what I mean? It's like yoga's maybe even worse on that. And it's that makes sense, that experience that you wouldn't feel empowered, right? Like this, you wouldn't feel empowered by that.
Yeah. And so the whole point is like when strength training is done and the person who's doing it feels like they have choice and they are empowered and it's manageable for them, then it's like magic. But as soon as it gets to the point where it's not manageable for them, it becomes traumatic. And I think that a lot of people go into the fitness world and they have that experience where somebody tries to push them too far, where teachers just aren't trained to be sensitive. Like until I did very, very specific trauma-informed training, I had no friggin' idea. I thought that everyone wanted to be pushed harder and teachers need that education. Teachers need to know.
If I can jump in, if I may, there's two ways to go wrong with that, isn't there? Like one is, if we look at trauma, definitions of trauma normally involve the word overwhelm, right?
Yes.
And so does exercise. You should hit your muscles till they're overwhelmed and then they grow bigger. It's like almost the same terminology. And I feel like there's two ways teachers can go wrong with that, isn't there? Because in the same way as trauma is about overwhelm, then resilience, whether that's muscular or psychological, is built by overcoming greater and greater obstacles and actually feeling like, as you said earlier, how did you put it? The resistance that you worked and you weren't overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
And it's the same, it's Nietzsche, it's will to power, essentially, which is that feeling we all have. And little kids are like this. They want to overcome an obstacle. Kids will push their edge, And equally, a yoga teacher that's always like soft, just relax, don't push your limits. Like that's equally unhelpful because they're not actually building, being relaxed isn't what builds that strength or that confidence. It's overcoming within that zone of tolerance without being overwhelmed, right?
Yeah, you do have to start to nudge it forwards a little bit. And I think that if we nudge it forwards a little bit over time, it stays within the window of tolerance. And it really depends on the movement we're talking about. So that day in that workshop, we were doing snatch and clean and jerk. Both movements, which if done poorly can, end very catastrophically. Whenever you're jumping and throwing a weight over your head, I think you need to be more sensitive with your students. If I'm teaching a class and we're doing friggin' hip bridges, I feel like I need to be less, everyone be careful, don't push your boundaries, because the exercise itself is so much safer. There's so much less room for error. So if I'm teaching somebody box jumps, that could go in a whole lot of different ways. If I push somebody too much, they can go up, fall down, hit their head, whatever. If I'm teaching somebody how to do wrist prep or some ankle exercise, there's more room for people to experiment with going further and pushing themselves further without having to worry and feel that much threat, because a bar is not going to come crashing down on you.
Yeah, it's not the same as, some catastrophic Olympic weightlifter injury video from YouTube, where someone's elbow pops out. That's probably not going to happen in a kind of just a simple bodyweight situation. So confidence, strength. Oh, yeah. And I guess what complicates this a little bit, and this is what I see a lot in embodied yoga, is 50%, no, not a 50%, a third of my students' personalities, they don't want to approach that limit. And 2/3 want to go over it.
Right.
Do you see what I mean? So in any one class, there's kind of two groups of people who have a, and that's not a strength pattern I'm talking about. That's a personality pattern. That's excess yin or excess yang is the model we would use. And it seems like in any class, any teacher has to negotiate. And I think it's about 2/3 because it's our culture. It's not neutral. It's not 50-50 just because the culture is slightly more yang, and that's pushing is generally considered the good thing. But alternative culture can be the opposite way as a swing back. So it's you're also managing the personality pattern. Is is it just me pushing too hard because I'm Mark Walsh and that's what I fucking do? And then it's equally and then there's also within the day, I had a day off on Monday, right? I had a massage and hypnotherapy and I hang out with my wife. Then I went to yoga in the evening and I just really wanted to push it because I'd been resting all day. And if I'm normally on a Monday, I've been working all day really hard and I just want to slow down. So it's there's all those factors. It's pretty psychologically dynamic, isn't it?
There's all those factors. And, people ask me all the time about programming and how many really hard days a week do you do and how much do you rest and da-da-da-da-da. And it's there is no formula. My policy is if I go to my practice and I have lots of energy and I don't have a whole lot else to do that day, I'm going to go all in my practice. However, if people come to class and it's 6 p.m. and they've already had a whole day of work and they're all exhausted, I'm not going to push them as much. And it's really difficult in a group class environment to give the right, you're going to say the best cues that you know how to say, but then what do people actually do? That could be a whole other ballgame. One thing that I find really helpful for myself and for the people I work with is in my training practice. So I have done quite a lot of Buteyko breathing method. And my Buteyko teacher, my breathing instructor, his thing is you should never exercise to the point where you're breathing through your mouth. And so I've done like months and years of the Buteyko actual breathing exercises to rehab my breathing, because that was something I had been struggling with. And so now I'm at the point where I can push myself to any intensity level and only breathe through my nose, which means the nervous system stays more regulated. I'm not spinning the wheels, and I can go further but stay more calm. And I think that in exercise and in fitness and strength training in particular, when people begin to push themselves so much that they breathe through their mouth, and most of us are not even, they don't even think that that's a thing to be aware of, then we start to spin the wheels, and that's when our sympathetic nervous system goes up, and that's when we get into this like super more competitive zone where we're like, oh, I can do this, I can do more, I can do more. And I think that that's when we are running the risk of overdoing it. And so something I literally say in almost every class I teach is like, if we're going to do push-ups, first of all, I don't tell people how many push-ups they should do. I'm like, let's just start doing some push-ups. And when you get tired, come on down. But if you start breathing through your mouth, come on down. And that's kind of like the barometer of like, how hard are we actually pushing ourselves? Because the breathing shows us so much. And the breathing is so different every day. Some days you can do 20 push-ups and sometimes you can do 10.
Yeah. I don't count, if I'm doing it. It's like, I'm just doing it. And I would just a little, as an embodiment teacher there, I would say that there are times when it's good to let the jaw relax and the mouth open and the drip down your chin as you're throwing your head back in ecstasy. So I'm not adverse to the mouth opening at times, but it's if you're working on kind of relaxation and control and kind of, it's nice to have those, it's just my breath steady, those measures, which can be, that makes sense that you would do that. And what else, like you do mindful strength. So is that just the brand? I mean, is it just mindfulness combined with strength work? I imagine it's mostly kind of body weight kind of orientated. What does that look like if I would come to your mindful strength workshop in Cornwall, Canada, which confused me because Cornwall's in England, so I was confused. But what would that look like?
So I would say the majority of the people who show up, I'd say like 80% of them are people who are involved with yoga. Lots of yoga teachers come. But then there's always like other people who are athletes or whatever. They go to CrossFit or something like that. So most of the time I'm teaching in a yoga studio. And now what I'm starting to do a little bit of is these yoga studios are also renting some gym space. And we get to go into the gym as well, because it's gotten to the point where like, we're talking so much about resistance training. We're talking about load and lifting and pulling and all of this great stuff. And what I find is that sometimes people like to talk about these things and we could just talk about them forever. But we really have to go do it a little bit and have the experience of actually doing things that are different to be able to get it. So most of the stuff I do is body weight because, again, most of the time we're in a yoga space. We do quite a lot of joint preparation. So taking all of the joints and loading them very gently. So again, staying in that like window of tolerance, manageable zone, but putting load on our joints in all different positions. So kind of getting away from this idea of like perfect alignment. Well, this is how my hip is supposed to move in the most optimal way. So that's how I'm going to train my hip to move. And it's like, we all know that as soon as you go off of your yoga mat or out of your gym or wherever you're doing your exercises, your body starts to now move in ways that are not optimal, regardless of how you've trained them. Nobody is the perfect robot. Nobody's knee never goes valgus.
And it's okay, right? If it does, it doesn't kill you if your knee goes off to the side one time. And I've seen Ido Portal has all these exercises like walking on the edges of the feet and things like this. And it's the kind of last thing you would think you could kind of train, but as long as you're not doing it all the time, it's fine.
Yeah, and your body gets so much stronger. So then we train our joints and the parts of our body to be strong in any different position, not only in one cookie cutter position. And so the goal, I think the theory is like we train our bodies to go out of alignment so that when we go out of alignment, it's less detrimental.
I was just about to ask you the question. Do you think the concept of alignment makes yogis weak? Because I think it does.
Yeah, I think it does as well.
Because you're constantly going through a particular line, so you're not getting used to, like one of my keto teachers says, it's good to wobble. In the wobble is where you're building the strength, the sinew, the little muscles. Like it seems to be something about constantly being in a line, which is unrealistic, but you're not preparing the body for actual movement, right?
Yeah. So it's two things. If you're going always in this perfect alignment, perfect position, that's the only thing you're training. So what we know from strength training is that strength is specific. So strength is specific and you only adapt to what you actually do. So if I want my body to be strong in as many ranges as possible, I actually have to go and I actually have to load in as many ranges as possible. So, like I do simple exercises in my class. You have a block in your hand and we're internally rotating the arm and externally rotating it and moving the block in all these different ways. And, people get their arm into a position that they've never been instructed to go into and they lose all sensation of their hand and the block falls on the floor. And it's like, what just happened? Everyone is strong enough and mobile enough to do that exercise, but they completely lose awareness because their brain just has no concept of like, how the heck do we do this move that I have, before viewed as improper or a bad movement or a bad position. And so, we create these bad positions in our body by not doing them and not understanding how to do them.
And I want to come back to the point you made there about, most people don't realize this, but it's quite specific on how our body learns. So, for example, you could get good at cycling and you still wouldn't be better at running, and they're both still aerobic fitness, right? Like you could get good at lifting one weight and even a slightly different weight at a slightly different angle. And there's not as much transfer as people think with fitness, which in terms of just like fit for life is kind of disturbing. And if you're doing a very specific movement, like the primary series every morning is a very specific set of movements, what you're training is those movements. And you're going to get very good at the Ashtanga primary series. And you're not going to get stronger for life unless the movements just happen to be the exact movements of a chaturanga or whatever, which is, I don't know when I ever do that in my life. It's, it's kind of strange. And I heard Rafe Kelly he was talking about food groups and the equivalent of micronutrients, like in how having a lot of variety in your diet is healthy, and the same thing movement wise. So what do you think of this idea of sort of movement variety versus kind of eating the same thing every day?
Yeah, I think movement variety is the key. I think that it doesn't necessarily have to balance itself out week after week. I think if we look at the bigger picture, if we look at an entire year, if we look at a month, things can start to balance themselves out. I think that movement, at least where I live, movement feels very seasonal. Mm-hmm. So now it's winter and there's a lot of snow every day pretty much. And I spend way more time in the gym and I lift way more weights, as opposed to in the summer when we're like training outside and hiking and going to the park and doing chin-ups outside and stuff like that. Like, I don't think it always has to be this perfect balance of like, well, I do my 20 minutes of cardio and then my 20 minutes of weights and then my 20 minutes of this and then I sit down for 5 minutes.
It depends on the rest of your life as well, right? Like, do you have an office job or do you work on a farm? If you work on a farm, are you harvesting at the moment? Do you have a new partner? So you're having sex every day? Do you, I just made the mistake you talked about. I was just coaching a guy in Boston and I said, I'd like you to spend an hour every day outside to be more in your body and to feel the wind on your face. He's like, Mark, it's -15 now. I was just like, yeah, sorry about that. So what other ideas do we have? It's just not it's not a good idea when it's -15 to be spending so much time out with the wind on your face, So it's really dependent, as you say, on the seasons of your life and the seasons of your year and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think overall it needs to balance out. And I think it really can balance out. Like, 3 years ago, I moved away from the big city and I moved to a smaller community, basically so I could train at a better gym. And at that point, I started practicing jumping movements. So my partner is like Mr. Weightlifting coach, really good at jumping, super, super springy body. And my body, coming from like yoga and then powerlifting, was like very dense and strong and not springy at all. And so over the last 3 years, I've been working on my jumping. Not every week or every day, but over 3 years, I've worked on my jumping to the point where now it's like jumping feels totally different. And I post these videos and people are like, oh, you're so springy. And I just hope that they don't think that that was naturally there, because if you could see the before and after, like the 5 years of difference, like, oh my God, I remember being in the gym with my coach And he has got a small box and he's like, okay, jump on top of the box. And I'm just looking at it being like, my body has lost this intelligence that should be kind of in there to just jump onto the box.
I'm going to jump into the jumping thing. And as you say, there's certain movements that might not be practiced in any art. Like generally yogis don't jump, which is weird. Generally they don't hang from things or pull up from things, which is weird because, you know, we're monkeys, right? Generally there isn't necessarily a lot of twisting movements in yoga, for example. And I'm just taking yoga. I don't want people to think I'm picking on yoga, because equally, if I took Aikido, there's lots of movements that just aren't in Aikido. You know, there's certain movements you just don't find in Aikido. And it's interesting; they all have psychological correlates as well. So, in terms of sort of to bring it to the sort of body mind theme of the podcast, in case people think, you know, hey, why do I need to jump? I don't need to jump. You know, that's not. And it's like, I mean, firstly, I'd say if that's part of your evolutionary heritage, it's kind of a loss and it's kind of sad. But it's more than that. It's part of your psychological heritage, right? To be able to jump for joy, to be able to like hang on things. There's something in that, to be playful, you know? And there's something like the playfulness I see lost in a lot of people who are doing a weights practice or a yoga practice, just so people don't think I'm picking sides here. Like that playfulness I really see lost, because it's just generally not something that's encouraged in a yoga or a gym culture. So it seems to me these movements are not just, they're part of our psychological repertoire as well as our movement repertoire.
Yeah. And I mean, I really think that like, it's kind of the same thing, you know, when we're moving our bodies, things are happening in our brains. The brain is being triggered in different ways, you know, like cross body movement, fast movement, slow movement, feeling like we have the options to move the body in these different ways, I think creates just a different type of neuroplasticity and a different type of learning curve. And, a lot of the movements that are really simple that we do, like cross patterning and crawling work and like kids movement and bouncing a ball up on the wall and stuff like that. It's in people's brains is why they can't do it. It's not in their bodies. It's like their bodies could do it. Pretty much anyone can like bounce a little ball on the floor, but our coordination gets off, our rhythm, our timing, like we're not like listening to music and dancing so much anymore. And I think that, of course, all of those things, yes, can be looked at as like fitness exercises. And then, of course, can be looked at as like just the embodied experience of what is it like to hang on the bar? What is it like to bounce the ball on the floor?
So what are some of your recommendations then? So you've got, someone's listening to this. We have listeners all over the world. They all do different things. Right. What are sort of some of your recommendations coming out of, because I can imagine this could get like a very long chore list very quickly, or maybe they're thinking, strength, it's not for me, it's a bit scary. I don't want to go to the gym and lift badass weights. Like, what would you say to people out there who are listening to this?
I think that you don't need to necessarily go to the gym necessarily. People always ask me, what type of equipment do I need to do this stuff at home? I think if people had 2 kettlebells, like a lighter kettlebell, like something that you can lift with your arms, and then a heavier kettlebell, and then a very lightweight, like 3 or 5 pounds, you could do a lot with that. And with these weights, we can pull, we can push them, we can swing them. Kettlebells are really interesting because so they've got a handle on them, and then you flip it upwards with the bell heavy part on top, and you're just handling the handle on the bottom. It's like, it's very wobbly. It teaches the body to do something that's different. And I think that another thing about strength training and this type of training in general is like, it doesn't take as long. I mean, I used to go do my Ashtanga practice and it would be like a 2-hour situation. Yep. And I don't think people need to be lifting weights or doing strength training necessarily for that long.
My body weight exercises are 15 minutes a day. I do 10 pull-ups, 5 handstand press-ups, a few tricep press-ups, a few side raises. Like literally, I can do it in the equivalent of a coffee break from an office day at work. And the feeling I have in my body of doing that regularly is completely different from when I don't do that. So it's a fairly large body-mind, forget physiology, physiology. My wife likes my shoulders or something, which is nice too. But, the aesthetic quality, but it's also like I feel different from that 15 minutes a day, which is pretty efficient as far as
Yeah.
body mind practices go. That's not bad bang for your buck.
Yeah, it's very effective. People can stretch it out and people can shorten it down, but it really doesn't, I don't think it takes as much as people think. And I think if people are new to this type of practice, you're new to strength, we have to keep in mind that the first part of the body, the first part of the system to adapt is the nervous system. So if I say, okay, you're going to go home and start doing 25 push-ups a day, and you actually do that, in 3 days from now, something will be different. Like something is going to be different in your upper body. Your push-ups will feel different. So you've gotten stronger, but you haven't gotten stronger because you've actually put on more muscles.
Yeah. People can increase the number of push-ups from say 10 to 15 in 3 days, which isn't enough time to 50% increase your muscle mass. That's just biologically impossible. So the nervous system's adapting, right?
The nervous system, your body is getting better at doing the movement, number one. And number two, there's more connection between the brain and the tissue and more motor units in the tissue, da-da-da-da-da. And so, especially if people are new to this, it's like you don't have to have this long and very intense practice. This nervous system adaptation goes on for months. It takes between 1 and 2 years for your collagen fibers in your body to remodel. And so that's quite a long time. If we just did like 15 or 20 minutes every day or every other day for the next year, we're going to feel totally different. And slowly over time, we can build this up, but it doesn't have to be really intense right out of the bat. And I don't think you have to go to the gym. Like I've got online courses, and most of my online courses, I literally film in my living room. And I'm doing the exercises in the living room using like my couch as an exercise and using a chair for another exercise.
Yeah, my requirement, I was traveling around hotels a lot, I still do. So it's basically like if I have to use any more equipment, more complicated to a chair, I said, I was working with a personal trainer, just did 1 or 2 sessions. That was all it took for him to give me a few exercises. And it was like, I need to be able to do this in a hotel. So it was all body weight stuff. I use my niece a lot as well. If I hang her upside down for my back, I can work the triceps. I squat with her on me. She loves it. So like small children, I think excellent for this as well. But, there's ways, there's things you can use other than kettlebells, right? In terms of.
Yeah. Just like find something to stand on that's a little bit wobbly. Find something to stand on that's a different shape than you're used to putting your foot into. Like the body is just this huge sensor thing, and it's just sensing our environments all the time. So if we wanted to adapt emotionally or physically or whatever, same thing, we just need to give it new stimulus. And because the body is constantly sensing the environment, if it's used to sensing the same environment over and over, like if you're only used to stepping on something, having the traction of your foot and it's not wobbly and it's the perfect shape for you, then that's what we adapt to. But if we want a little something different to happen, there needs to be new stimulus to the body. And so any way that we can provide the like sensory body with any type of new stimulus is going to be helpful. So that's just a different way to look at the whole strength training idea, where it's like, it doesn't have to be chin-ups at the gym. It's just like, let's do something that's a bit different.
Yeah, like as you said, like take your shoes off when you're walking, or go to your friend invites you to a class just to hang out with your friends. Say, okay, like let's just do your thing tonight, and you go to their dance class that you don't normally go to, and there's going to be an adaptation, isn't there, to all of those kind of things? Just using your always just a mindset. Like I was standing on the tube the other day in London, which is our what do you call it, subway, and it was just moving, and I just stood there and I was like, wow, this is really cool. Like my body's getting an adaptation right now. I was just standing there trying not to like hang on, and just without using the side and using my whole body. And people thought I was weird, but it's London, so nobody looks at you. And it was great. And I was like, wow, all of a sudden I've got 10 minutes of really cool, novel stimuli rather than just an annoying journey, It's like a mindset as much as anything, I think.
Totally. Yeah.
Cool. So we need to wrap up fairly soon.
Okay.
This has been fun. In terms of finding out more about you, where can people go?
Yeah, so my website is kathrynbruni-young.com, and there's online courses. I host my own podcast. I teach workshops all over the world. In 2018, I'm coming to Europe.
Great. Well, let me know when things are up. I can share those. And just to spell your name, it's KATHRYNBRUN for November, young.com, right? Did I get that right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, great. So people can find you there. And do you have a closing message about the body for our listeners?
Like a one-liner?
Anything you want.
So I think my closing message, this is what I've been doing lately. I want you to try to find a stick in your house, like a broomstick or something, and put it on the floor and try to stand on it and just watch what happens. And don't just watch what happens in your body, but just watch what happens in your whole ecosystem. And this is like at the heart of the mindful strength practice.
Excellent. You're the first person that's answered that question with a movement riddle, which is really original. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.